Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 25th, 24th, depends where you are in the world, 24th, 25th of January 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Pause the video. This is a late night mapping update. I don't like to go a day without doing an update because I get all out of sync. So it's for my own kind of sense of continuity. I need to make sure I do one every day, and then we all know what's happened in the last day. If we do 2-day updates, we're just not so sure of exactly what's been going on. Actually, a lot of these pins, as you can see, there's quite a few pins here, and they are predominantly blue. So that's good news for the pro-Ukrainians amongst you. Now, you might think that this indicates a lot of activity on the front line and the Ukrainians pushing on in a number of places, but it's not necessarily the case, because actually most of these changes are from Andrew Perpetua's mapping. And the reason why he has made so many changes is because he's had really clear satellite data that has allowed him to do comparisons that he otherwise hasn't been able to do due to the fact that it's been autumn and winter. And that means that there's a lot of clouds, being very difficult for him to get good, clear shelling analyses done. And what these satellite images do is allow him to compare data points and see where there has been a large amount of shelling over recent time periods. And because he's been able to do that, he's like, okay, right, so that means the Ukrainians are actually here, not there. Russians are here, not there. That may have happened over the past, however long. It's not necessarily last 24 hours. Anyway, as you can see in the northeast, I'm not going to go to the Institute for the Study of War. It's going to be a relatively quick one. As you can see, there are no changes to the mapping until we get down to around Avdiivka, where the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back, as according to Andrew Perpetua, in that area, or had never advanced that far. Not wholly sure. There's been a few bits of equipment, I think, lost in the Avdiivka area for the Russians. I mean, that's generally the case in an awful number of places along the front line. But anyway, that had been one of the areas where there's been a little bit of worry for the Ukrainians. We had the Novoherivka area, then this Avdiivka area where the Russians had taken quite a bit of territory, and then of course further up here recently the Krokomalna area there. This has been relatively quiet. Andrew was talking about in his live stream last night that this is one of the times when the Russians had advanced and taken a place without doing too much heavy shelling. He was saying that the approach they have is attack somewhere, and if you take it, you take it. And if you don't take it, you retreat, try it again, retreat, try it again, okay, and then hammer it with artillery, and hammer it and hammer it and hammer it, and then go again. So if you're lucky enough to take a place without too much resistance, then there's not a lot of shelling activity to see. Otherwise, you're probably going to see quite a bit of shelling. He's saying that around here, there hasn't been that much shelling, which would indicate that the Ukrainians probably didn't put up an awful lot of resistance, and the Russians were able to take Krokomalna fairly easily. Anyway, to come on down to the Crimea area, there's quite a bit of activity, particularly around the Avdiivka area, but no changes to the mapping there, and around the Vasily area as well. It gets mentioned quite a bit. And then here, although this isn't changed to the defensive lines, it's just worth noting that actually this is for Andrew Perpetua, so he's got the Russian defensive line there, and the Ukrainian defensive line was back here. He's moved the grey zone, the Ukrainian defensive line further into the grey zone. So the Ukrainian defensive line is now here, and that's because the Russians are shelling there, and that would mean that the Ukrainians are indeed in that position, which is slightly better news around Avdiivka, and giving that extra tiny bit of buffer zone before you get to Chasiv Yar. Anyway, as we come down to Klishivka area, no changes to the mapping around there. We saw some claims yesterday about perhaps half of this trench area seeing quite a bit of battle with the Ukrainians possibly taking some more of that trench area back, but that's not been confirmed by any of the mappers that I use as sources. So we come all the way down to Avdiivka, just to let you know. Let's zoom out, see where we are. So we've come down past Crimea, past Bakhmut, and down into the Avdiivka area. We can see that north of Avdiivka, where we have Stepova, the Ukrainians have had some joy here by the railway line and have pushed the Russians back to that railway line. That's Andrew Perpetua again. So good news there. And then quite a big change for Deep State map here. So they're the only ones that have got a change in this area where there's been quite a lot of worrying activity for the Russians. I don't know if this... So the previous line so it came up here and came back down. Went a bit like that. And they completely moved the Russian control from there, kind of shifted it sideways and expanded it into this residential area, into these dachas there. So quite a big amount of land taken by the Russians, but shifting it from further to the east, which I've found interesting because it means that, as according to Deep State map, the Russians do not control this road coming up into the dacha area, but rather have a control through the forest area into that residential zone. So interesting. The other mappers, though, have that area under control, the control of the Russians. But no changes to Surat maps or Andrew Perpetua in that area, which is good news. Possibly a bit of stability there, but the Ukrainians have been under an awful lot of pressure. And Zenit, I think there was Andrew Perpetua was talking about that in his live stream again. I think it's highly unlikely that the Russians have control of that, as according to Surat maps. We discussed that yesterday at more length in yesterday's Frontline update. So I just want to we're going to go back to Avdiivka. I'm not going to leave there yet because Tatarigami has some analysis of it. So latest on Avdiivka and helicopters operations thread. By late 2023, Front Intelligence, so that's the kind of outfit that he works for or helps with, Front Intelligence Insight noted a stabilized situation in Avdiivka. However, recent developments have worsened the situation for Ukrainian troops, especially in the southern residential area, and that's where we were just talking about. While the northern part of the Avdiivka is shielded by the AKHZ industrial buildings, the southern area is comprised by 1 to 2 story houses susceptible to artillery fire. If unable to capture the area, Russians raise it with artillery, deploy infantry, and seize rubble. And as you can see, there is quite a bit of artillery activity taking place. So the visible artillery strikes from the outskirts of from the outskirts to residential areas indicate the shift. Eventually, the damage makes defense challenging. The same problem extends to nearby multi-story apartment buildings targeted by previous Russian FAB hits. The whole of Avdiivka has absolutely been hammered by both artillery and aviation guided glide bombs. It's been very difficult for the Ukrainians. So here, this is to the north where you got Stepova. Just up here is where the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back. The situation on the flanks remains more stable, enabling Ukrainian forces to defend Avdiivka. Satellite imagery shows a continued shift of artillery fire north of Avdiivka, targeting areas near Stepova, Berditsy, Novobakhmutivka, and Novokanivka. So the Russians are still trying to hit those places. In summary, Avdiivka's situation has worsened due to limited artillery ammunition, a decrease in counter-battery fire, and a lack of reinforcements. Russia exploits these gaps, leveraging its personnel and ammo numbers advantage. Resurgence of helicopter operations as well. So this is slightly different now, a different place as well. Our team previously identified that's a forward operating base, a FARP, forward arming and refueling point, helicopter base in Strelkova, following Ukraine's ATACMS. So this is by Henichesk, just the north of Crimea, northeast of Crimea, where there's that Arabat spit that comes down from Henichesk. Anyway, following Ukraine's ATACMS strikes on airfields in Luhansk and Berdyansk, the base was abandoned and remained unused until recently. Recent imagery from January 2024 reveals the presence of Russian helicopters at the base. Analysis over multiple days indicates that Russians keep no more than 3 to 4 helicopters at a time. Additionally, the helicopters appear to be more dispersed. But they are there. We continue to emphasize the need for a sufficient supply of weaponry to Ukraine to achieve a shift in the balance of power. Small numbers provide a short-term advantage, with operational success possible under the right conditions, but the enemy uses his time to adapt. So that is a shame that the Ukrainians don't have, obviously, ATACMS at their disposal to be able to hit that base. As our team previously indicated in the analysis, Russians are likely, so going back to Avdiivka now, are likely to continue erasing residential areas in the southern part of Avdiivka. The recent analysis shows that over the past few days, the intensity of fire has increased and it's concentrated in the residential area. So yeah, lots of shelling taking place around that Dacha area. I mean, look at that, the very dark figures there. That's the 23rd of January, and that's the 21st of January. So actually, this is later, as you can tell by more artillery more artillery pockmarks there than you can see in the one to the right. Slightly different contrast used on that map, but essentially it's just really intense shelling. I mean, look at that. That's black with shelling. It's incredible. And down here as well, but all the way along that area there, which is, I presume, this area here. So really heavy shelling, indicating that the Russians are working hard to take that that settlement. Right, so we are now going to come down to Novomykhailivka. This is just around, just to the south of Mariinka. We have an area where the Russians, according to Andrew Perpetua anyway, the Russians took more land all the way down here. However, as mentioned the other day, it's not, that change didn't really indicate that the Russians had taken that, in the previous 48 hours. Actually, Andrew is unsure of this whole area since something like June or July or something like that, and then found some evidence to suggest that the Russians were occupying this area, and then they pushed forward into this northern area. Well, there's been some, good news for the Ukrainians, as they appear to control more of that grey zone than previously thought, giving themselves a better sort of buffer zone. Evidently, the Ukrainians are being shelled in those positions, which indicate that they do control that area. And then as we come further along, I've just noted another interesting move by the Ukrainians into the grey zone. I don't know if that's just a bit of evidence or whether there is. I mean, we have seen activity around Uruzhany, so it's more likely that it's part of the dynamic, twos and fros of what's going on there. But Ukrainian gains into the grey zone around Uruzhany there in the Velika Novosilka sector, and then we come on down further towards Chavony, where there has been some gains for the Ukrainians there. Those 3 gains indicating this pocket of territory that the Ukrainians control. So that's good news for the Ukrainians there. And then, or at least, they push the Russians back. And then as we come down towards Robotyne, we have some more gains, or at least some verification of Ukrainian-controlled land. So even if they didn't gain it in the last 24 hours or so, it's to signify that they do control that area. And the Russians are, well, at least it's not that necessarily that the Ukrainians control that area, it's that the Russians don't control that area, and more likely it's grey zone. In fact, that is all grey zone there, and the Russians further to the east. And then when we come down to Robotyne, just the final place to look at, actually just north of Novoprokopivka, it appears that the Russians don't control all of this ground in that area just north of the settlement of Novoprokopivka, and the Ukrainians may well have been pushing down from, if you remember, this is that trench area that I call the alien's head. There's two antennae coming off here. It's a bit more involved than just that polygon hints at, but it's been very difficult, this trench line, these trenches in these tree lines, for either side to maintain over a long time. So that has been recently an area that the Ukrainians have gained control of, pushing the Russians possibly back, although Syriac maps will disagree. But Andrew Perpetua has shown the Russians are way back to the north of Novoprokopivka. It's difficult to know how many of those gains were as a result of counterattacks in the last 24 hours, how many are just confirmation through looking at shelling for the first time in a long time and getting a sense of what's been going on. So that is the Frontline update. I guess fairly good news, or at least Ukraine control more, or Russia control less of the land than we previously thought they did. Not really sure what the Ukrainians are intending to do in many areas on the front line, given the challenges with boots on the ground and artillery ammunition. I imagine they would adopt more of an active defence than trying to pressure and take land back, although there will be certain areas that they will find more important than others, and will probably try very hard to wrest control back from the Russians there. Anyway, a lot going on today. The cargo plane in Belgorod, so all over the news at the moment, and different narratives being proposed from different people. I've seen more evidence to suggest. I've seen a little bit of evidence to make me go, oh, hang on. So it was the Ukrainians and what they said, actually, the general staff from the Ukrainians giving a kind of cryptic statement, but all the other evidence points to the theory that it was not a plane full of POWs. In fact, could well have been a plane with people on the way to Africa, like Wagner or similar mercenaries, Russian mercenaries on the way to Africa, taking off from Belgorod, possibly going to circle around and then getting blown up, rather than being full of POWs. But we'll revisit that shortly, for a short while tomorrow in one of my news videos. Anyway, in the meantime, take care. Speak soon.